welcome everyone. So today is the third session of our Leading Complexity Program 2023. And today we have Simon Wardley, and he's going to talk about situational normal, everything must change. And Simon is a former CEO, inventor of Wardley Maps, and also regular conference speaker. And I think I got to know about Simon quite many years ago from a colleague that had seen you talking at Lean Agile Scotland, where I know you've been talking many times. They missed you this year, I heard. And we were kind of joking that why are you named after a framework or a model? The Wardley Maps have gotten so known, and it's such a useful framework. I tried it a couple of times, and it kind of really sparks strategic conversations. It's really kind of easy to understand, but not easy to do, but fantastic conversations. So we're so happy to have Simon here today, and looking really forward to today's session. So yeah, Simon, you could maybe add on a bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, I'm going to say thank you ever so much for inviting, and thank you very much for the kind comments. The origin of the name Wardley Maps. So I used to just call them maps because I created this thing. I was using it. I started this in 2005, and so I would share it with others. And people would say, well, what are they actually called? And because they had a concept of value chain on there, I went, well, I suppose value chain maps then. And somebody said, oh, you can't have that. Somebody else has got value chain maps. And I went, oh, okay. In which case, I don't know, strategy maps. And somebody said, no, that's already been taken. And so out of frustration, I just said Wardley Maps, because it's highly unlikely that anybody else has got my name. and so that's where it came from. And it was just like, I just called them maps. But Wardley Maps, it sort of stuck, and since then it's grown. So now I get this sort of like it's interesting. I gave one talk where somebody came up in the audience afterwards, and they'd been using Wardley Maps, and they were surprised by my name was Simon Wardley. They asked me, was I related to the author or in some way, or was I named after them? And I had another one where the person was convinced that I was a dead economist, which was just like, because all good things come from dead economists. So I'm very flattered. It was lovely. So the origin was as simple as I'm terrible at naming things. And so, and just in desperation, I just said, oh, we'll just call them Wardley Maps, because it's unlikely anybody else would have those, since everybody else had got the good names. That was it. So at that point, I've got a presentation to go through, which will sort of give you an introduction into Wardley Mapping. Then I've got a mirror board, and then we can come back, and I've got some more topics we can talk about, or we can do a Q&A discussion. Quite happy how we do this. As we go along, I've got chat open. So if you have questions or want to ask things, or please just fire them in there, and we'll try and deal with them. Right, so I suppose the first thing, I better share my screen. There we are. Can I just check you can all see that? Excellent. Oh, let me... oh, rather annoyingly, I didn't realize that happened. My chat has disappeared. Do shout out if one of the Chris crew, anybody can shout out if there's interrupt me, or please interrupt me yourself. Okay, so situation normal, everything must change. I've got just to double check, I've got a little bar at the top which you won't see that. That's fantastic. Right, good. Now I've got my chat window back, so now I'm comfortable. Right, I'm going to talk about the origin story, basically how I got into maps. Then I'm going to talk about maps and what maps are. Then we're going to talk about patterns that we learn from maps. Then I'm going to talk about the issue of change. Now, at which point we can dive on and have a play with a mirror board. After which I've got two particular topics I want to talk about. One is communication, and specifically related to what's going on in the AI space at the moment. And the one after that is sovereignty. And this covers particular issues such as digital sovereignty, and what we mean by that. So let me start with the origin. For me, this all started in 2005. I was working for this company, for Tango. It was an online photo service. Had about 16 different lines of business, very successful, very profitable, rapidly growing, but it had a major problem. And the major problem was this person, the CEO of the company. Our CEO was completely clueless. They were making stuff up as they went along. They didn't have any understanding of what they were doing. Now, I know this because I was the CEO. I mean, I used to come up with these wonderful sort of vision statements. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. We were heavy adopters of extreme programming back in 2003. Kent Beck's actually a friend. We were heavy users of and also providers of open source. But this vision statement strategy was just words which I'd picked from other people and slammed into a sort of a document. It was meaningless. I didn't really understand what was going on, other than the fact that we were growing and making money. So I started to read every sort of book I could find on strategy, and I was getting absolutely nowhere. And then I happened to be in London in a bookshop, and the bookseller asked me, had I ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, to which I hadn't. And they, being a good bookseller, they persuaded me to buy two different versions of the book because they're all translations, so they're all different. And I don't speak the original Chinese. And I was very grateful for that because, I was living in this world of meaningless words. And by the way, if you want to cut this whole exercise down and you just want meaningless words, I think that ChatGPT does a fantastic job of creating, strategy statements for you, which is probably why actually, if CEOs are as hopeless as I was, why replacing your CEO with an AI is not necessarily a bad thing. This is NetDragon, which is a company in China. And this is actually their performance. They've outperformed the market since they've replaced their CEO with an AI. But anyway, this was way before this. This was back in 2005. I was there sitting in, reading these books on Sun Tzu. And because they were translations, it was in reading the second translation, I noticed a particular pattern. Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. The first is have a purpose, a moral imperative for what you're doing. The second is understand the landscape that you're actually competing in. The third is to understand the climatic pattern, the weather, the heavens, as he called it. So this is how the landscape is changing. Then you understand principles, so how you organize yourself, doctrine. And then finally, you understand leadership, which is about gameplay. And right at the same time, I was also reading something by John Boyd, which was all about, well, he didn't write a book on this, but somebody else did. It was all about the OODA loop. So John Boyd, you have the game. The first O of the OODA loop is to observe the environment. That's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. Then you orientate yourself around the space. That was what principles were about. And then you decide where you're going to act, and you act. And this is what leadership and gameplay is all about. And this sort of made sense to me. The combination of the two, I could sort of see, I've got to have a purpose. I've got to understand my landscape, etc. And this is what really got me into this subject of landscape. How do I understand the landscape that I'm actually competing in? And that got me into maps. So I started to read all about military history and their use of maps. And one of my favorite is this particular map. It's the Battle of Thermopylae. So Themistocles was an ancient politician, Greek general. And they had a problem. The Persians were invading. There's about 140,000 Persians. And so what they decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisia and force the Persians along a coastal road into a narrow pass called Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. So there was about 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans in that army. And this is where we get the story of the 300. But I was fascinated by how we used maps to communicate where people should be, what actions we should take. And so I started to think about, how do I make decisions in my organization? And at that time, I was using something called a SWOT. So I decided to create a SWOT for this battle. And here's my SWOT. Strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. And threats: the Persians get rid of us, and the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. And so I simply put these next to each other, and I asked myself, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described through some sort of map or a magic framework like a SWOT. And it was this point it really dawned on me that I needed to have maps. So the important thing was to understand the landscape. It's one of those 5 factors. In order to do this, I needed to have some sort of map. And the way I was trying to understand the space using magic frameworks was flawed. So I asked everybody in my organization, send me all your maps. I want to see all the maps. I was very excited by this. So people sent me business process maps, mind maps, customer journey maps, all sorts of maps, systems maps. And so I took one of the systems maps, and this is for the online photo service itself. And it has components like a runtime, website, compute, and CRM, customer relationship management. And so I took that one component and I moved it across the map, a bit like moving, Athens, or, moving troops on. I thought, oh, that's exciting. So I moved it over here and I thought, how has the map changed? And I was very disappointed to discover it hasn't changed at all. And that made me think, because if I take a geographical map somewhere like the Battle of Thermopylae and I move Athens, that map has definitely changed. So why hasn't it changed here? It took a little bit of time because I'm quite slow with this sort of stuff. But eventually I realized that all the maps I had one thing in common. None of them were actually maps. They're all graphs, all of them. Business process maps are business process graphs. Mind maps are mind graphs. Customer journey maps are customer journey graphs. They're all graphs. Now, just to explain the difference, the 3 images at the top are all graphs and they're all identical. Nottingham, London, Dover, 3 places connected by 2 roads, M1, M2. The 3 images at the bottom are all completely different. Again, Nottingham, London, Dover, connected by 2 roads, M1, M2. The reason why the 3 at the bottom are different is that in those 3, space has meaning, and that comes from having a compass. Whereas the 3 at the top, space doesn't have meaning. So you can move things around as long as you keep the connections the same, they are still the same. That's why the 3 at the top are graphs, and they're all identical, and the 3 at the bottom are completely different, and they're all maps. And that's the distinction between a map and a graph. In a map, space has meaning because it's associated with a landscape. Now, in order to give space meaning, you need 3 components. You need anchor, such as magnetic north. You need the position of pieces. So this is north, south, east, or west of that. And you need something called consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. So I thought, can I do this for a business? And so that's what I did. But, photo business isn't everybody's cup of tea. So I normally start by drawing out a tea shop just to show how you map something. So I want you to imagine you run a tea shop. So what's the anchor going to be? Well, we've got hopefully the public who are going to consume cups of tea, and we've got the business itself. We may have other anchors, things like regulators, other groups or stakeholders involved, but we'll start with the public and the business. And the public hopefully wants to consume cups of tea, and the business obviously needs to sell cups of tea. So we've got a connection through a cup of tea. Okay, so we've got anchors, but that's all so far. Well, it turns out that a cup of tea has needs as well. A cup of tea needs tea, it needs a cup, it needs hot water needs cold water, a kettle needs power. So what we've got now is a partially ordered chain of needs. And this gives us an idea of position. And that idea comes from the concept known as visibility. So to a member of the public, the cup of tea is very visible to them. But there are a number of other components involved in making the cup of tea. Of course, the power used to heat the kettle to make the hot water, the power is quite removed from them, so it's quite distant. So now what we've got is a concept of position described through visibility in a chain of needs. Now this is a graph. If I move a component, it says keep the connections the same, it doesn't change it. Well, it turns out that all of these components are forms of capital. And there is a common process by which capital seems to evolve. We start off with the genesis of novel and new, and we often get custom-built examples. Then we get products and rental services. Then we get commodity and utility services. So by taking each of those components and saying how evolved are they, we've now got anchor, position, and we've got movement. As in, things will evolve over a period of time. So this is now a map. And if I move something on this map, if I move the kettle, for example, ask why is it custom built, move it across, more involved, it changes the meaning of that map. Now, formally, we normally draw it like this, dotted line on the side saying value chain, thick line at the bottom, describing the evolution axis. And what I'm actually doing here is I'm exposing my assumptions about how we build a tea shop in a way that somebody else can look at it and go, well, you're missing staff, you're missing a mechanism of payment, you know, the kettle should be more evolved and we shouldn't be custom building kettles. Now, all of that stuff sounds quite simple, but there's a little magic trick here. Is normally in organizations, we tend to be story-led. And we tend to have an association between good leaders and good storytellers, or at least that's what we tell everybody. Now, the problem with that is if I've come up with a story and you challenge my story, you're actually saying I'm not a good leader. And so I will tend to get defensive. One of the beauties about putting the story on a map is I can challenge the map without challenging the person. So I'm not saying they're wrong in their story. I'm just saying there is something wrong with the map, or I disagree with the map. Now, all maps are imperfect representations of a space. So, you know, if you want to make a perfect map of France, it would be, or Paris, it would have to be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would be the size of Paris, and that would be useless as a map. So all maps are imperfect representations, which encourages people to make challenge. So let's give an example of this in action. This is an insurance company. This is 2011. They needed compute in their data centers. So this is their process flow. It's a graph. They needed compute, but they would order server. Server would go into goods in. Then they would modify, mount, and bracket. Now they had a big bottleneck in the modification mounting of their servers. So they came up with a plan to use robotics. They spent 6 months working on this, a team of people, looking at different vendors. They came up with a proposal. They did all their calculations, incredible return on investment, sub 1 year. So they're about to do this. And I was asked, I happen to be friends with the CIO, to have a look at this. And the problem is I couldn't just go in and say, oh, why are you building robots or wanting to use robots? Because they built this entire story and this entire narrative about this. They spent 6 months working on this problem. I'm just the person who's turned up. So I said, well, would you mind if we mapped it? And they were very resistant. but eventually agreed. It took us 15 minutes to map it. Now, just to give you an idea what we're up against here, these are the figures. So cost of server was about $2,500. The failure rate for the current method was about 8%. So they calculated average cost of failure, labor cost, annual number of installs, total annual cost, and their investment, $2 million, had a return on investment sub 1 year. So I mean, they were pretty adamant that this made sense. And just sure, looking at the figures, looking at the process flow, it did. And this is their map. As I said, it took them 15 minutes. User needs compute, order server. It requires a server, comes into goods in, rack mount, modify. Now we're simply able to look at the map and ask a question. Why have you got racking custom built? It turns out they had custom built racks because they'd historically had custom built racks. So what are the modifications you're making to servers? They don't fit our racks. So we have to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit our racks. And that's why you need to invest in robotics, yes. And somebody in the room just suddenly went, well, hang on a minute. Why aren't we using standard racks? Now, these people weren't daft. They were simply trapped by story and trapped by past context. This is something we call evolutionary flow. Because when you start to map it, you start to notice that sometimes you're custom building things which became a commodity long ago. So it was about half an hour later, they realized we don't need robotics at all. What they've been doing was optimizing process flow, which is the blue line. The blue line would have you invest in robotics, keeping the flow the same and improving it. All they needed to do was change the standard racks. Now, as I say, these people aren't daft. They were simply caught out by past stories, unable to challenge what was going on. And that's a very small example. In government, we had one case, simply by mapping it, we saved about 425 million, about 1.5 billion in its lifetime. Now, one of the things we do with maps is I do what's called pre-mortem, post-mortem. So before we start a project, we actually map out what we're going to do. We do pre-mortem challenge. So this is where we try to pick up the fact that, we're custom building racks or custom building kettles or whatever it happens to be. Then we go and build the project. And then afterwards, we do post-mortem learning. So we take the maps that we originally created and we look at them and look at what's changed. And it's through this that we learn patterns. Which brings me to my next topic. All right, I will show you, there are an awful lot of patterns with mapping. So there's about, as I mentioned, the climatic, there's about 30 patterns. These are economic rules of the game. There's about 40 different principles of organization. There's over 100 different forms of gameplay. Most people are oblivious to all of this. But I will take you through just a couple of simple examples. This is HS2, high-speed rail. This is James Findlay, a big heavy engineering project. Now, they wanted to build HS2 in a virtual world. This was back in 2012, before they actually built the railway. And the reason for doing this is it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we've got that wrong, rather than the English countryside. So this is the systems graph of building HS2 in a virtual world, the different components that were needed. Now, back in those days, the typical way in government that we used to treat projects is we'd outsource the whole lot, but we'd break it into small lots. So things related to user experience would be in one contract, things related to infrastructure another, things related to back office another, and so forth. Now, all of these contracts had various things in common. They tended to cause massive cost overruns and had very poor failure, well, very high failure rates. So James decided to do something else. It was a Sunday afternoon. He decided to map out the space. And he sent me this map and said, how do we actually manage this? Now, for me, this was fairly straightforward because I'd been mapping for about 7 years at that point, I'd already learned that as things evolve, their characteristics change. So on the left-hand side, we call it the uncharted space, where things tend to be chaotic, uncertain. And over time, it becomes more industrialized. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about money, penicillin, or computing. They evolve, they move from one side to the other. And because of this, I'd learned there's no such thing as one size fits all financing or purchasing or project management. So back in 2002, 2003, before I had maps, I'd actually said to my organization, we'll adopt Agile, we'll go extreme programming everywhere. Extreme programming is a fantastic methodology. Of course, we quickly learned it doesn't work everywhere. And so using the maps, we could see that Agile development extreme programming is very good on the left-hand side of the map because it's good at reducing the cost of change, and change is the norm on the left-hand side. As that thing evolves, eventually it becomes industrialized, and there you don't want change. You want to reduce deviation. And so things like Six Sigma outsourcing are very strong on the right-hand side. And of course, in the middle, it's all about learning and reducing waste. And this is where things like, lean, so you think Scrum, MVP are very strong. So we simply applied that to the map. The stuff on the left-hand side, you would use build in-house with Agile techniques. The stuff in the middle, if you're going to build, you use something like Lean, or you use off-the-shelf products. Stuff on the right-hand side, outsource to utility suppliers. If you're going to build Six Sigma, it's the right way to do it. So what we learned was to use appropriate methods. Now, this project ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee because it was delivered way ahead of schedule, way under budget, unlike much of the rest of HS2, unfortunately. But this bit succeeded. One of the patterns we obviously learned from that was there is a world of difference between using Agile, such as using extreme programming, and being Agile. Being Agile is more about using appropriate methods. So that includes using things like Six Sigma and things like waterfall where necessary. If I go back to the original contracts, so this is the original idea for how to break up this project. If I take one of those contracts, such as Lot 1 engineering, and I simply overlay that onto a map, I can tell you that contract's going to fail before you've even signed the paperwork. And the reason for this is in a contract, we try and define what it is we want. And that's going to work for the components on the right-hand side. So the two components there, they will be efficiently treated, but the components on the left-hand side will always occur excessive change control costs because you cannot define what you actually want. We're still learning about that space. And of course, what typically happens is when these projects fail, people say, oh, well, it's because we didn't specify it right. Well, the problem is you attempted to specify it in the first place. These are very, very common problems. People not focusing on the users and their needs, or the business and its needs, or the other stakeholders and their needs. Second problem is people not actually understanding the components involved in the system. The third problem is people not actually challenging what we're doing. So we're using custom-built examples where things have become a commodity. The next problem is people misapplying methods, trying to use extreme programming everywhere or Six Sigma everywhere. Doesn't work. Everybody tries to create the all singing, all dancing magic method, which fits everywhere. Save, you name it, doesn't work. The next problem is most of our contract structures are flawed as well. We need not only different project management methods and purchasing methods and finance methods, we need different types of contract structure. Now, as I said, there's that's use appropriate methods is just one pattern. And there are many different patterns. There's about 30 climactic patterns, 40 doctrine, about 100 different forms of leadership play. And I'm going to talk about the climactic patterns because we use that in change. All right, as I said, there's a lot of climactic patterns here. And I'm going to talk about a few. Everything evolves through supply and demand competition. Components can co-evolve. Higher order systems create new sources of value. Efficiency enables innovation. That's componentization. Success breeds inertia. Let me show you how you use those. This is a map of computing circa 2004. So user needs an application built on best coding practice, built on a runtime, built on an operating system, built on best architectural practice for compute as a product. It's not just physical activities you can map, it's also practices. We just give them different labels: novel, emerging, good, and best. You can map data, map knowledge, you can even map ethical values. So this is roughly where computing was in 2004. One of the first patterns you learn is that everything evolves. If there's a supply and demand competition, it moves from left to right. So in 2006, we started to see this with compute. We went from compute as a product, compute as a utility, which unfortunately was called cloud. But it's a standard pattern. The next pattern you learn is that past success breeds inertia. And that past success can come not only because of investment in physical capital and other forms of social capital, but because of investment in practices as well. So if you had an organization which tended to have large data centers with lots of computing infrastructure, they were, and have been very successful in that, they were likely to have lots of inertia to the change that was happening in front of them. The next pattern you learn is that as things evolve, you get a co-evolution of practice. And that's because the underlying change of characteristics. So it doesn't matter, again, whether it's money or penicillin or whatever it happens to be. If you take compute, when compute was a product, we had a characteristic called high mean time to recovery. So when your server went bang, it would take months to get a new one. And because of that, we used to do lots of things like capacity planning, so we didn't run out of space. We would do N+1, making machines highly resilient. We would do disaster recovery tests to find out what went wrong, or prevent things going wrong. Now, as things evolved to more of a utility, they went from high mean time to recovery to low. So it didn't take months, but seconds to get a new machine. Because of that, we could start to distribute systems. We didn't have to worry about capacity planning. We need more machines. We just create them as we needed them. We could do design for failure. So rather than doing all this making super resilient machines, if a machine went pop, we can create as many as we want as quickly as possible. So we started introducing things like chaos engines, or Netflix had a variety of those. We would distribute systems. We'd do design for failure. We started doing things like continuous deployment. We couldn't do continuous deployment in the past because we were waiting for months for the machine to turn up, but now we could. So you've got a whole bunch of new emerging practices as a result of the underlying systems change. The next pattern you learn is componentization. So as the underlying components evolve, become more of a commodity, they increase the speed that we can build higher order systems. So it's if you use standard bricks, pipes, planks, it's faster to build a house. So in 2008, you saw an explosion of new services building on top of the cloud. And of course, the next pattern you learn is those new higher order systems create new sources of value or worth. Those are powerful forces. Efficiency at the bottom, speed in terms of practice, new value in terms of the new systems being created. And if you're in competition with others and somebody else has those advantages, that creates enormous pressure on you to adapt. And as more people change, that pressure mounts, and that leads to something known as the Red Queen effect. Basically, you have no choice over evolution. So in 2008, I was running strategy for a company called Canonical. The operating system. We are about 2 to 3% of the operating system market. We're up against Red Hat and Microsoft. They've got all the billions and all the people. We're tiny. But we had a map. And we knew that cloud was inevitable. We knew there'd be an emerging practice. I didn't know Andy and Patrick was going to call it DevOps, but we knew there'd be an emerging practice. We knew there'd be new things built on top. So that's where we focused. Now, we were 2 to 3% of the operating system market. We spent $500,000. That's what we could afford. Took us 18 months. And we attacked those areas. And we specifically also didn't attack best architectural practice on computers as a product, i.e. the data center stuff. We realized that was going, so not to invest. Anyway, we were 2 to 3% of the operating system market. At the end of 18 months, we were 70% of all cloud. And that was us up against Red Hat and Microsoft. And Ubuntu still pretty much dominates the space. So if you are into computing and you remember, those sorts of days where it was like Ubuntu was almost never heard of and then Ubuntu was everywhere, that's because you were mapped. Of course, this doesn't stop. Supply and demand competition drove the emerging practices. As I said, Andy and Patrick gave it a term, DevOps. Best architectural practice for computers as a product got a new term. We called it legacy. The runtime then shifted to more of a utility with serverless. And that's created exactly the same pattern again. New emerging practice. Eventually, we give that a name, FinOps. New things being built on top. So what's the point of saying this one? Well, it teaches you that strategy is iterative. So where you would focus in 2016, invest serverless, FinOps, the new things built on top, where you would avoid DevOps, cloud, all of that stuff is heading towards the new legacy, is fundamentally different from where you would focus in 2008. Not because you've done anything, but because the market around you has changed in a fairly rapid period of time. Okay. Of course, if you can't map it, you can't see this. Anyway, that can all be explained just with those 5 patterns. There are many other patterns, but as I said, we have limited time. If you want to read more about this, there's a wonderful book called The Flywheel Effect, Dave Anderson, which uses mapping in the insurance industry. You'll also find a book called Reaching Cloud Velocity, which is AWS's second book. So obviously Amazon does a lot of books. AWS, this was their second book they published. It has about 17 pages of mapping in there, including a particular system called ILC, which I wrote about in 2005, which is how they chew up basically industries. These days, I use mapping all over the place, from healthcare systems to defense. It's even gone into space. This was NASA and Planet Labs, the Carbon Mapper satellite. The actual groups behind the scenes, they work with to communicate with each other using my form of maps, which brings me on to the topic of communication. So there are 2 additional topics I want to talk about, communication and sovereignty. But before I get there, I've spoken a lot and I want to go on to Mirrorboard because I want you to have a practice, and I've got an exercise for you to do as well. So let me stop. I can go, I can now see my questions. My apologies for that. Well, let me first of all get the link to a Mirrorboard. And what I will do is I will share the Mirrorboard. So if any of you can't come and join us on there, at least you'll be able to see it. Oh, I can see lots of people joining. Excellent. Let me share my screen. Okay. Just somebody's already said hello. I'm Mike. Let me all bring you to where I am. I don't know how familiar people are with Miro. Hopefully you all are. Just quickly throw a post-it note or something on there just so I get an idea. You'll find on the left hand. Oh, look, perfect. Isn't that wonderful? Great. Good. Well, it's an absolute delight and pleasure to meet you all. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move you all over to the side slightly. Let's unhide this content. What I want to do is just show you the simple basics of how you go and map something. As I said, the first thing you need to do with maps is you focus on the user need. So that obviously requires you to describe who the users are and their immediate needs. So we might go, public needs a cup of tea. So say we're doing a tea shop. The business might need to generate revenue. So the next thing we do is once we've got that, is we want to create the graph. So we want to start understanding the details. So we might go public needs a cup of tea, needs hot water, cold water, kettle, needing power, needs a supplier, there's a variety of tea. I've got two more here. I brought on business and we'll put on revenue. So what we'll do is we'll simply go business, we'll link that to revenue. There are tools, lots of tools out there for building Wardley maps these days. We might just connect it that way. Then what we need to do is once we've got our basic graph, then we need to go through asking how evolved are these components. So I added business and revenue. I might go, well, business, how well do we understand what a business is? It's pretty commodity. There's nothing special about running a business, particularly not a tea shop. So we'll put it, say, here. And revenue, well, that's well understood. Nothing special about making money. So we'll put that over there. We'll connect it like this, and we'll connect it like this. And there we are. That's the start of our map. Now you might go and you'll look at this map and think, you know, I disagree where you've put some of these components or whatever it happened to be. Fair enough. You might say I'm also missing a whole bunch of components. We talked about revenue, but surely I need a mechanism of collecting revenue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's put a timer up. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. There we are. For everybody else to come and add all the components you think I'm missing on my tea shop. So if you think I need white, whoops, oh, what happened there?
Have you locked?
Oh, okay,
Right.
hang on a minute. It was locked. Let's have a look. Activities, no. There we are. All right. That's strange. Okay. Can you see it okay?
I guess it's fine, yes.
Yes.
Have you locked
Okay.
it now?
It was locked beforehand.
Okay. There is a function so you can make sure that you are the only one who can unlock, because else everyone can unlock, and maybe that was...
Yeah. So when you find a component that's locked, please don't unlock it and then move it. That's the function I use. Okay, let's give everybody a few minutes. Tills, excellent. Seating places. Interestingly, you've got custom tea blends here. Now, normally when we talk about custom tea blends, what we're actually saying is we're mixing multiple different forms of commodity forms of tea. It's a bit like my Mini. My Mini is designed for me. Well, that's only because it's got about 8 different types of commodity wheel, 6 different types of commodity dashboard, about 10 different types of commodity trimming. And what you've got is just the combination effect. You keep on multiplying up the combinations. Suddenly you've got millions of possibilities made out of a whole bunch of commodity type items. But from the point of view of marketing, it's often very good to try and persuade people that it is customized to them. It is designed for them, even though it mostly, really, the only difference is the volume of things that we're mixing together. You seem to have grabbed a big piece of real estate on the screen. Spices. Designer drugs. That's an interesting choice. That certainly is relatively novel, I would say, for a tea shop. I used to, many, many years ago, work in the restaurant industry, where, of course, the service hospitality industry, I suppose we should call it. And, you know, we would have things like home-cooked food. And, of course, what we mean by home-cooked food was mass-produced in a factory food, which somebody had sprinkled a few ingredients on top at the very, very end. That is, you know, all you need to do to describe it as being home cooked. So it was highly industrialized processes with a bit of marketing and a bit of mischievousness to describe it as something it really, really wasn't. Okay, if you can just unclick away from, let me, I'd be very, very grateful if you could, so I can grab this frame, and there we are, put it back to where it was. Thank you. Oh, it's a copy of the T-shirt frame. Okay. Right. Well, let's leave that there, and let's lock that. Great. So once you've done this, you see, you can come along and you can look at the assumptions that people have made and start to question things like biscuits. Really, biscuits? Surely they're a little bit more evolved. And we can discuss how evolved a particular component is. We can talk about the components that were actually, you know, sandwiches again. You know, I'm going to argue it's sort of like, I mean, they're important. I mean, almost every tea shop has biscuits and sandwiches, but most of them are, you know, pretty industrialized things. Even alternative milk. I mean, I can't think of a tea shop where I haven't which doesn't have oat milk or something along those lines. Website advertisement. I think website we can stick, you know, I'm going to argue we can stick over here as well. Social media presence. Yeah, stick over here. I think advertisement. Okay, marketing. I think quite a lot of those are, you know, we could argue are more commodity-like. Customer feedback. Well, we've already got revenue over here and the business. Customer feedback. That's an interesting one. Maybe, you know, let's put that in there. Take those out. Customer feedback. How often is it? I think most tea shops would say they understand their customers and they get feedback from their customers. Menu. Oh, those you'd think are quite industrialized, pretty standardized. Fresh flowers. I mean, most of the things, psychedelic tea blends, okay, designer drugs, I'm going to give you those. Those, the mushrooms, those are very much, quite unusual, would be sort of, well, it depends on which part of the world you're actually in. I mean, some parrots serving tea would be another example of something which is genuinely, quite different. But most of the stuff you're going to say is probably quite commodity, quite industrialized for a tea shop. Right, I've got another exercise for you to do. And the practice of mapping is simply that. Use mapping more and you get better at it. And once you start producing a map and you can start challenging and having those discussions, you start to learn the patterns, which you can then apply to later maps. So what I'm going to do is hopefully I've locked this one now. Yes, oh, good. Except for these pieces. Great. Let me bring you to where I am. So what I've got with this map, remove that. This is a self-driving car. Now what I've done is I've translated all the components of the self-driving car into Elvish. So it's a graph, a systems graph of a self-driving car in Elvish. Now, the reason why I've done that is if you talk to most people in finance and you talk about IT to people in finance, it's often a bit Elvish to them. So I want to give you that experience. So what I want you to do is you've got these little dots over here. One is outsource, one is buy a product, one is build your own. I just want you to move. If you think this should be build your own, move that square there. If you think this should definitely be outsourced, move that there. Let's give you about a minute to work out how we should manage this project. I'm not even going to take a minute. I think we'll cut that down to 30 seconds. Excellent. I can see we've got very strong opinions about certain things being built with agile techniques and certain things being outsourced. That's pleasing to see. All right, I'll stop there. Obviously, this is a graph. There's no evolution on this, but unfortunately, this mimics the sort of decisions we get involved in, trying to work out what to outsource, what's not. So I'm now going to take exactly the same diagram, the graph. I'm going to convert it into a map. So I'm going to bring you over to where I am. Exactly the same exercise. So this is the map, still all in Elvish, of all these different components. I'll give you a minute. Off you go, work out what we should outsource, what we should build in-house, what we should use with agile techniques. Okay. There we are, I'll stop that. Of course, it's much, and what I can do now is then go and tell you what the components actually are. But the point about this is it's much easier to, once you start mapping things out, you can sort of have discussions about how we are treating things. Even though I might not know exactly what these words, I can see, if we've got something which is a commodity and we're trying to do it custom built, I can ask that question, why are we doing that? In the same way, a kettle, I might not, I can see that the kettle should be a commodity rather than it being custom built. So that's just one example. All right, so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. I've got some more slides to go through. We can talk about communication issues, particularly about AI, and then we'll get into sovereignty issues. But I'm also quite conscious about the fact that I've talked a lot, and I don't like talking a great deal. Do you have some questions that you'd like to ask? A question mark. PB. Yeah. Peter, yes.
I would have a question, because in the beginning part of your presentation, you
Yeah.
were using the visibility axis, and
Yeah.
then you switched over to value chain. So could you elaborate a
Oh
bit
yeah,
about the
sure.
switch?
Of
Yeah.
course I can. Of course I can. So what I will do is I will share my screen again. Okay. Can you see that? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So let me just make this full screen. Full screen mode. I'm just going to use a pen actually. Annotate. Great. I can use this pen over here. Super duper. All right. So you've got the user at the top. And what you've got is a value chain. So there's one value chain going down this path, going down here, etc. So DevOps needs cloud, runtime needs an operating system, best coding practice needs, that's the value chain. That's why it's got value chain over here. And when you, another way of thinking it is, a value chain is normally within an organization, and then, you know, a supply chain often consists of multiple value chains of different organizations. Okay, so that's the wider term. Now, in terms of visibility, so whilst it says it's a value chain in here, in the older format, people used to write, you know, visible, less visible at the bottom. But remember, it's a partially ordered list. And so what that means, let's change color. Suppose I've got a component here connected to cloud, which goes straight up to the user. Well, that means that through that particular pathway, this cloud becomes, and so we'll give this a term, let's say it's green energy usage. So normally if I'm building an application, I mean, which cloud I'm using is quite far removed. I mean, to the end user of my application, do they really care who your cloud provider is? Probably not. But if suddenly green energy was a big thing, then who your cloud provider is suddenly becomes much more noticeable, because not because through that chain, but through this chain. So what you've got is often multiple chains expressed on a map, and visibility is within a chain. So if you're going down this chain of application to best coding practice to runtime, then the cloud provider is, you know, not very visible. Most of you probably don't know if you're using something like Dropbox, who runs Dropbox's infrastructure, and if they change it, if it runs on Amazon or Microsoft or whoever. But you can also create other chains in there, and so all of a sudden these underlying components become much more visible. So within this chain of green energy, your cloud component is much more visible than it is within this chain. And that's why there isn't an axis on the left hand side in terms of, you know, specific points of, you know, this is mid visibility, this is high, this is low, because it's within the chain itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. Thank you very much.
Hey, no problem at all. Was there any other questions? Please just shout out.
Yeah, I was the one with
Yes.
the question mark.
Oh.
I have two questions. So, is there any thoughts about granularity on the maps? Have you thought anything about that? And the other question is,
yeah,
when you combine or you find something new,
yeah,
and you move to the left on the map,
yeah,
and including that, I see the arrow, the horizontal arrow says evolution. Would you call that sort of a revolution when you go backwards, or acceptation if we use Dave Snowden's language in a sense? And also, does it also have more scalability as far as you go to the right? You make it more scalable, you can scale out, and you have structures for making it scalable, and those structures break when you have this revolution or acceptation to the left.
Okay. Exaptation is a term from biology. I mean, I'm a genetic engineer by trade. So I'm actually friends with Dave Snowden. And we came across each other because we generally ended up at the same conferences arguing lots of other people, but arguing in the same way. So granularity. The first thing about maps are imperfect representation. Of course, we have different scales of maps. So we have atlases of the world down to individual home maps. Remember, our geographical brethren have their first maps are a couple of thousand years ago. They've had a lot more time to get their maps sorted. They didn't suddenly appear with Ordnance Survey maps in detail on the first day. If you go and have a look at early maps, it's very much earby dragons and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. They are barely recognizable as maps. So we're very still, you know, we're, what is it now, 18 years or so into the field. It's still very, very early days. I would come back in 100 years or so if you want Ordnance Survey style maps of business, of cultural systems, of political systems. I mean, we're very, very early days. So when you are mapping, one of the things that people will often do is they will, when they're mapping out a space, they'll put components on. There'll be too many components, so they can aggregate them together. They can create, each of these components you can see on a map are actually entire maps in themselves, so that's perfectly fine. And then you'll often elevate components and reduce components based upon if it's important for trying to explain the situation or the environment we're actually looking at. So that's your first question. Your second question is it's standard componentization. You know, in terms of, if I draw this, as things evolve, they enable higher order systems to appear. And of course, you can get combinations of things to create new things. So, you know, that might be cloud. There might be, I don't know, machine learning. There we are. And then we get things like conversational programming, or whatever it happens to be, or some sort of chat bot, or whatever we happen to be. That's perfectly normal. Things being combined together to create new things. And what was your third question? Scale. Yeah, so very much this is where on the left-hand side we're dealing with what's known as differentiation of function. On the right-hand side, it's about differentiation of operations. So very much on the right-hand side, it's all about scale, heavy industrialization, minimizing deviation. On the left-hand side, it's much smaller scale, much more deviation, much more change. But of course, you know, industrialization to a commodity begets genesis, and then eventually that stuff will industrialize, which begets further genesis. So they're not disconnected. Hopefully, I've answered all your questions.
Yes, sort of, I guess. But the structures that are at place when you scale out will break when you have the genesis, when you move to the left. You will...
the underlying components don't change. They just become, you know, it's things like compute existed long before cloud. EC2 wasn't anything novel and new. It was just industrialization of what pre-existed. Because otherwise what will happen is people will go, oh, we're doing compute, compute's over here, and suddenly we've got this new thing called cloud, which is compute as a utility. And so people are constantly shocked and surprised by, or they shouldn't be shocked that every product turns into a utility. But if you don't describe it in that way, then people suddenly become shocked and surprised by things like cloud. It's something new. It's not. It's just simply compute as a utility, which is why many of us were expecting it long before it appeared. And you should have been. And that's also why people who are like cloud, serverless, oh, well, maybe. It was never a question of if, it was only a question of when. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, sure. I could keep on discussing this, but I will let the other people ask.
Oh, yeah, sure. Next question. Any other?
Yes, we have a question from Shamir.
Hello. Yes.
Like to unmute and
yeah, sure.
turn on your camera as well, please.
So that comes on okay. So I just had a question. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I just had a question around kind of the granularity of these maps. Like presumably you're going to get to a point where, I mean, if you're mapping out like let's say an organization or whatever, it's going to get quite big. Are there ways of like rolling up and down the granularity? Like are there kind of, let's not say rules, but are there kind of heuristics that you've followed around when to create new maps for particular areas to kind of dive deeper? How does that kind of function?
So when very much at the moment, and because each of these components on a map can be an entire map in itself. So what tends to happen is when we find it becoming too crowded, we'll tend to group components together. We'll think, well, all of these things have a common name, so we'll call that, we'll put that component on there, we'll move those components off to a different map. And then sometimes during the discussion later on, we might go, oh, that component was really important, so we might bring it back into the map. So it is a process of having multiple people together to try and discuss or talk about what actually matters. There is no, it's very, very early days. As I say, give it 100 years, and it'll be long after I've gone. We might have ordnance survey maps. At the moment, it's still very, very primitive.
Okay,
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Oh, somebody said I recommend learn Wardley Maps. Oh, Ben's a great guy. Totally agreed. I Mastodon. I'm not on Mastodon. Well, I am, but I just don't use it. I'm still on Twitter, I'm afraid, or X as they call it.
So we have a question from Per Österlund. Just checking. Are you able to unmute?
I'll try.
I'm trying. That's great.
So yeah, well, the question was if there's a have you experienced problems in distinguishing between a product and a commodity? Like, do they tend to float together somewhat?
Yeah. So there is an entire. Hang on a second. Let me just stop sharing for a second. What I will do is I just need to go and get something. Hang on a moment. So all of this stuff I built using text analysis of publications. This was back in 2005. And I created something called the cheat sheet. So if I share my screen, there we are. Can you see that?
Yeah.
All right. So basically what it has is we use different terms depending upon if we're talking about practice, knowledge. Actually, we can actually map ethical values here as well. So formally, we should say stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, but that's not very meaningful. So we go Genesis, custom, product, commodity. And we're doing data, it's unmodeled, divergent, convergent, modeled, practice, novel, emerging, good, and best. So this comes from all this text analysis, which I did, and I hit that underneath this a whole bunch of characteristics. So when we're looking at something, if we sort of can't quite decide, is something a product, is it something a commodity? The first thing we ask is whether that thing is in fact two different components. Okay. Because often that one thing can be broken into two different components or three different components, and two of which you find are commodity, and it's one which isn't. So the first question you should ask is, when we're talking about something, is it really just one thing, or are we actually talking about multiple components, which is why it's creating confusion for us. The next thing we'll tend to do is we'll go through this list. So we might go rocket launchers. Okay, rocket launchers. Well, where are rocket launchers? Widespread, rapidly increasing, slowly increasing, rare, we'd probably put them there. Rocket launchers, certainty. Poorly understood, rapidly increasing in learning, rapidly increasing use, fit for purpose, commonly understood, we'd probably put that over there. Publication types. Do we get lots of publications talking about the marvel of rocket launchers, or building, construction, maintenance, operation, focused on use? Yeah, with everything that SpaceX is doing, it'd probably put it over there. Market undefined. And so we'll just literally go mark these off, and you'll probably end up finding that rocket launchers are probably somewhere around over here. So you would probably say late product, early commodity. So we use the cheat sheet to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot of sense. Thanks.
Okay, this is all Creative Commons, has been for 18 odd years. So please just help yourself.
Okay, so next question we have from Ian about the Cynefin framework. Ian,
Yes.
would
Hi,
you like to-
hi, Simon. I was curious to. I know that you do a lot of stuff with Dave.
Yes.
It's interesting what you see the differences and similarities are, and perhaps how you see them, perhaps where they complement each other.
Yeah.
You know, one going before or after, or where they support each other as sort of two kind of maps.
So I think they're complementary, and the reason me and Dave say that is because both of them have a common origin in terms of Max Boisset's work on the ice cycle, because when I was looking at the whole sort of process of how do things evolve, I was very conscious of that. And so I was looking at frequency rates of publication types, which is how I came up with the whole evolution axis. And a lot of Dave's stuff comes from that sort of space as well. So we talk pretty regularly. If you think about Cynefin is, if I'm looking at, well, let's start off with the first time I'm looking at a problem. My map is a blank map because I've got no information whatsoever about the environment. So I suppose the first thing I'm asking is, what sort of environment are we actually talking about? And I think that's where Dave's stuff is at. He's got a whole bunch of new stuff, which is creating maps as well, all to do with various energy gradients in the space, which I think is really cool. But you start off by trying to think about, am I dealing with a space that, well, the first time I fit a space, I have no map at all. My map is a blank map, so it's somewhat chaotic, as in I know nothing. That doesn't mean there aren't things I can't know. And of course, it may be a case that I'll end up with a map with about 3 or 4 components, and they're all highly industrialized, which is pretty simple. Or it may be I'll end up with a map with about 60, 70 interconnected components, which is rather complicated. And it may be a case that, there will be components which are very much in the Genesis custom built, and as well as all over the place. So you end up with a system which is, shall we say, more complex. It doesn't mean none of it can be understood. Of course it can. It's just that certain aspects, our complex system will have certain aspects of unpredictability about it. So I think the language and the terms are quite complementary. I like his stuff though. I mean, my advice to you would always be use whatever is useful. There isn't, I don't think there is a right tool. There are different ways of looking at the problem. You should find what you find useful. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Okay, so next, Mats, please unmute and put the camera on.
Yeah, hi. I might be tweaking your map framework a little bit, but since we can see value chains pretty easily in it, we can detect them and draw them. Do you know any instance where you have used this kind of mapping for a whole different purpose than the strategy one, but to find value streams within an organization? Because it's very visual.
To find value streams, so new potential areas. I've just finished.
Not new potential, but normally when we try to reorganize for agility, we want to find the value streams, and in a messed up organization, it's really hard to see the value streams we already have. And there are different ways of finding those, but it just struck me when you draw this blue line. It's like, wait a minute, this might actually be a way to do that really easy.
Yeah, I mean, is that a common, uncommon activity? No, and often it can be quite terrifying. So I would tell you, so an example would be a particular organization they were looking at investing in weighing machines. And it was like, okay, why are you investing in weighing machines? And well, it's because they count the number of forms produced, because so many forms, their job is counting forms. And so many forms are produced that it's actually cheaper to weigh them and use an algorithm to determine the number of forms that have been submitted than it is to actually count them up. So they wanted to automate this and invest in new weighing machines. So I said I went to this organization. I went to their goods in department, and I asked them, where do you get the forms from? And they had different distribution sites all over the country which sent in the forms. Okay. So I went to one of the distribution sites and said, you send all these forms over here? Yes. I was looking around, they had these big printing facilities. I said, where are you getting the forms from? Well, we print them out. Okay. And where do you print them out from? Well, users fill in our online website, and then we print out the forms and send them off to this other group. Do you know what they do with them? No. They weigh them to work out how many you printed out. And we got 15, 16 of these groups all around the country, all with big printing facilities. And so basically the entire process of, could be of printing out the form, shipping it, having somebody weigh it, and you run a calculation to work out how many forms have been printed, could just be replaced by select count star from table. And the issue is, they're talking about investing in building new weighing machines. It's just like, when you look at it, you just go, well, this is because you actually don't understand what it is your organization is doing. Once you map that out, you can see, look, people fill in these online forms. You don't have to print them out and then weigh them to work out how many people filled the online form. You can just select the count from the table. So that sort of stuff occurs quite frequently. Is that the sort of stuff you mean?
Not really.
No?
But yeah, I don't know. When we try to organize for agility, we want people that does the same kind of work for the same kind of customer to work together. So we kill as many dependencies as possible. And to find those kind of groups within a company, it's like we are working on the same kind of value chain, value stream, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And we're working on kind of the same area of the business, or the same product, or the same revenue stream.
Yeah.
Even if I'm on the component side of DevOps or whatever.
Yeah.
Then we have multiple ways of doing this, but it's usually a fucking hell, to be honest. It's a mess.
Okay, so this touches on duplication, I think. So Department of Agriculture or Rural Affairs, DEFRA, we have a horse tracking system which tracks horses, and then we have a cow tracking system which tracks cows, and then we have a pig tracking system which tracks pigs, and a chicken tracking system which can, so we've got one of these for every different type of livestock. And somebody, why don't we just have a livestock tracking system? Now, I thought, government, the levels of duplication would be was worse than anything you could imagine the private market. Well, that's because I was naive. I worked with one pharmaceutical company, and they had something called enterprise content management systems. Great. In fact, they had more than one. They had 350 teams building enterprise content management systems around this organization. And they had a global effort to build the global enterprise content management system. But of course, they had more than one. They had 8 global efforts to build the global enterprise content management system. So what you had is 350 teams building enterprise content management systems and 8 global efforts to build the global, none of which were talking to each other. And I thought, you'll never get worse than that. Oh, we did. Risk management in finance. I had a particular bank. We stopped counting when we got to 2,000 risk management systems. So it's just like, this is just how do you operate? How do you survive? Well, quite simply, because they're competing against other people who are just as hopeless. So that's perfectly normal. So is that the sort of stuff you mean?
And I also, go ahead.
No, but
Go ahead, Johan.
I was thinking, like, what I hear you ask, Mats, is like, can you use Wardley Maps to find the value streams? Could you use it as a tool to find those value streams? Is
Oh,
that
yeah.
where you...
Yeah, and not
Well-
not to find new ones, but to find to sort of make
To
our
help.
existing ones pop up and be visible, because they're invisible in a large organization, or actually it doesn't have to be a large organization. In a normally fucked up organization, it's invisible.
I
And
don't see why not.
Yeah.
Maybe we should let some other people in as well as
Sorry.
to ask questions. Yes,
Thanks
thank
a
you
lot.
very much, Mats.
Pleasure.
So next one, Ruth, would you like to unmute? Let's see if you are still here. I'm missing you out. Okay, so the question is this a super tool for design thinking?
Is it a super tool for design thinking?
Yes.
I don't know. It's a map. For me, they are an imperfect representation of a space, which I find very useful. And because I found it useful, I made it Creative Commons and allowed other people to use it, because I said, I find this stuff useful. And so that was, what, 18 years ago. I mean, these days, I teach at various places because it seems like more people find it useful. Is it a super tool? I think it's a tool. I think if you find it useful, you should use it. If you don't. I wouldn't describe it as a super tool. I'm not even sure what a super tool is. Threat modeling strategy, I see. So the sort of stuff I map is nation state competition down to healthcare systems, often across security. I run these groups. Let me share my screen. We did one on sustainability recently. I've got one coming up on the impact to the gaming industry. So if anybody is into gaming industry and wants to get involved in a mapping session, it's running the end of the month. It's normally 5 days. It's 2 hours a day. Let me just show you what it looks like. Hang on a second. Let's go find sustainability. And let's share my screen. Share screen. All right. So what we do, so normally, when I run these sessions, we'll get about 80, 90 people together. And the first thing we'll do is we'll say, okay, what matters, like in a field like sustainability? And what you'll get is a huge number of things people will put down: reduce reliance on fossil fuels, minimal impact, natural resources, the economy, equitable economic, loads of stuff. All right, I've just tidied it up over here. So you get a mass of different things. Now, what we want to do is try and work out what actually matters. Part of the problem that we have with managing complex and complicated environments is if it's beyond the capability of the governing system to understand what it's being managed, it tends not to make decisions, which is why we often try and pretend that what's being managed is simple through the use of KPIs, simply because it makes it manageable, because then people can make decisions, even if those decisions are not necessarily anywhere near the sort of decisions we need. And the example of that would be healthcare, which we don't have healthcare systems. We have sick care systems, because we don't actually measure health outcomes. We measure clinically reported outcomes, which is completely different. All right, so what you've got are a whole bunch of themes.
We are actually at the end.
Oh, shall I just run for a
Slides.
few minutes, or just I'm happy to run for a few minutes if you wish. I can see some nodding heads. If others want to disappear, please do. I'm a rebel.
Yeah, I see that a few people are starting to drop out. So depending on where you are in the world, I hope to see you next week. In the next session, it will be Peter Senji for 2 hours. So prepare for that. But yeah, Simon, go ahead and wrap up what you have.
Very, very quickly then. So what we'll do is, once you get all these ideas, we'll ask people to group them into themes. So they'll group them into the economy, stable society, regeneration, circular economy. So you've got multiple different themes. And from that, we'll ask this group to pick. So they vote on a number of themes that they think are important. So they chose modeling and understanding complexity, measurement, technology, innovation. Now, the reason for doing all of this is, imagine you want to decide what's important in Paris, but no one's ever mapped Paris. Well, you can send one group in to map Paris and they come back with a map. How do you know if the map's right? You have no idea. So what you do is you send multiple groups to map a space. They'll come back with different maps from their own perspectives. And then you can ask the question, what's the important features of the map? And so you'll get multiple maps and you'll probably discover that, you know, the Eiffel Tower is the most commonly important feature. One map over here might be Pierre's Pizza Parlor is the most important feature because they mapped it from the perspective of where's the best pizza place. Eiffel Tower was mentioned further down the list. By aggregating, you discover what's actually important. So this is what we do. We take the group, then each of these groups break into mapping out space. So this is mapping sustainability from a complexity perspective. That's what the group did. And they went through the process of refining and updating these maps until they get to common consensus that this map is a good enough explanation of the space. Another group, they did exactly the same for measurement. So all the different components in measurement. Now, these were people who were working in the environmental field, professors and all this sort of stuff, as well as people running companies. There's one on technological innovation. So they create maps of all these different themes. Now, you'll see that some of them have different sort of marks and colors on them as well. That's because what we do is once we've got a general understanding, this is where we now ask the groups the question. And the question is, you know, where should we invest? What matters? And so using their map, they'll come back with like measurement, sustainability from the perspective of measurement, that what really matters is standardization of measurement, truer prices, disclosure support. And then you'll get, from a complexity perspective, they come up with things like panting, characterization, data collection and measurement. And so now what you can do is across all these maps is aggregate that together, which is exactly what we do, into different themes. So you start aggregating that together, and then what you discover is that certain themes come out top. And those themes are, from a sustainability point of view, when you look at what actually matters across multiple maps, the thing that matters most singularly is civic engagement. After that, compliance and auditing. After that, measurement. After that, manufacturing practices. After that, government policy. After that, financial systems such as carbon offsets. After that, data sharing. And right down the very bottom of the list is technological innovation. And what's interesting is when you compare this to what the analysts say, they have it almost reversed. So they have technological innovation, financial system, metrics, government policy. That's where we should be focused. No, actually, number one is civic engagement, compliance and auditing, measurement. And you see this across, just to give you an idea, that's sustainability. I mean, I've been doing this work across defense, agriculture, manufacturing, retail, huge, you know, transportation, healthcare, all sorts of different industries, telecom, cyber. There's a huge amount of work, which we're of course making, because all of this stuff is Creative Commons. Education, just finishing that one off the board. Actually, it's a bit late on that one. Should have done that already. The work's already been done. That's fascinating. Again, with education, we're focused on, you know, the wrong spaces as well. Anyway, if you want to be involved, we are doing one on the gaming industry, which is the end of this month. Just drop me a note and I'll send you the details. Was that useful? Sorry to overrun.
Yes, this has been great, Simon. The sustainability mapping is something that sticks with me right now. And using Dave Snowden's words, I want to hear more stories like this.
Well,
So
that took 10 hours in total.
Yeah.
And that was about 80, 90 people coming together.
yeah,
And so we could all break into groups and map and then come back and identify the areas, bring them all together. And that's what came out of it. Number one issue, civic engagement. Okay,
Wonderful.
by a mile.
yeah. And Luis, I don't know if you're still here, but maybe we should go to the gaming event. Is it
So
a date?
I was thinking the same. Yes,
So-
go.
So just to, because gaming's really interesting, because gaming is one of the when you map out cultural systems, and there's a lot to mapping out cultural systems, you find that memories, particularly in art, have a very strong influence on beliefs and how we interpret beliefs. And so art is a major factor in how you change society. And the largest form of art today is interactive video games. By quite a mile. So there's an awful lot to gaming. Now, just to I've got people from war gamers to people in the gaming industries, some huge companies coming along as well. And there's about 80 or so.
Simon, I think we should book you for a week.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
We could go on the whole night.
Well, I will shut up. I'm just going to show you the details. My apologies. My apologies.
Thank you.
I just share the details very, very quickly, and I do apologize. It is there you are, full screen mode. So we're doing it the 30th, 31st, 1st, 6th, and 7th. So it's basically Monday, Tuesday, and then Monday, Tuesday. Is that right? No, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Monday, Tuesday. Okay, it's 2 hours. It's 1300 to 1500 UK time. We've got lots of people from the gaming industry all over the place. I'm particularly looking for people who want to come along with sociology, anthropology backgrounds, education. We've got some educational theorists already there, which is good. Game theory, game design, that sort of stuff, all good. You'll find me on X as Swardley. That's my email address. If you want to come along, just drop me a note. We're quite light, unfortunately, in this particular group on the number of women. We're only about 25%. So obviously, to get the best ideas, I need to increase the diversity of the group a little bit. So big preference there. Drop me a note if you want to come along, and we'll do exactly what we've done on the sustainability. It takes about 10 hours, 2 hours. Every day for 5 days. At that point, I will shut up. I'm certainly overrun. My apologies.
Well, we are very thankful for having you.
It's a pleasure. It's a delight.
And with all this inspiration and all the engagement that you have created here with our with our crew in the Leading Complexity program, we so invite you back again.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. I'd be delighted to.
Yay!
Thanks a lot. See you next week.
Thank you, Johan. I guess that was you.
Pleasure.
So I have a cheat sheet here now. So core system leadership capabilities for leading in complexity is next week's topic, and Peter Senge will be the thought lord, I was going to say, but that's you.
Yeah.
But he will be the next thought lord. So that will be for 2 hours, so between 5 and 7 p.m. European time, I would say, CET time. And yeah, thank you for you guys who stayed here. We are still 34 people on the call, and as usual, we'd love to hear your voices, and maybe you can say goodbye in your own way if you want to use your native language or something else, but let us hear your voices.
Maybe.
Elvish,
Yeah.
yes.
But before that, we will send out a pre-read for Peter's session. So just look your mailbox
Yes.
in a couple of days. Awesome.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Hej,
Thank you.
hej.
Bye.
Tack så mycket.
Hej, hej då, tack.
Tack och hej.